a locked room, an open window. Nothing adds up. Welcome to My Night Detective. I am your host, Elderwick. Tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Your voices bring this mystery to life. Let's begin. There are days when Oxford is only a memory, a ghost of what it once was, thin and fragile, like the morning mist that rises and vanishes without a trace. I sat on the stone steps of the King's Arms, cigarette between my fingers, watching the sunlight flicker against the river, caught in the treetops, and thought that the days of summer, though officially gone, had not yet given up entirely. The air held a faint promise of rain, the kind that seems to linger in the bones long before it ever touches the ground. I was mulling over the crossword, the one I had brought with me but hadn't touched in an hour. The clue had been trapped by absence, still seen. I'd filled in half the answer before I lost interest, though the final piece wouldn't come to me. Perhaps it had already been solved, a solution disguised by layers of intellectual dust, as so many things are in this city. A stray thought drifted in, something from the past. Words from a lecture by that now-forgotten scholar who once spoke of absence and presence in the same breath. But it slipped away as quickly as it had come. I stubbed the cigarette out, the embers still glowing faintly on the damp stone. The wind was shifting by the time I rose and crossed the narrow alley towards the pub's heavy wooden door. Inside, the warmth was a relief, and yet it never quite reached me. I ordered a pint, not for the taste, but for the silence that followed. Oxford, if you allow it, is always too loud, if only in its stillness. The echo of minds that never stop turning, the weight of history pressing in from every corner. The walls, draped in the shadow of centuries, whisper their secrets. I've always wondered how many of those secrets remain locked away in rooms or in minds, too tired to care anymore. It was then, as I sat by the window, that I noticed the paper on the counter, folded, half open, carelessly discarded as though someone had simply abandoned it. I didn't intend to read it, but I could not help myself. The headline caught my eye. Sudden Death at St. Cuthbert's Guest House. The name meant nothing to me at first, but then I remembered. A quiet corner of the college, where forgotten souls often passed their days. Or perhaps I was simply imagining the melancholy that followed me like a shadow, making everything seem forgotten even before it had occurred. I let my gaze fall onto the words, but I had no particular inclination to pursue them further. The death had been sudden, they said, and surely there was nothing remarkable about it. Certainly not something to pull me from my musings on a perfectly ordinary afternoon. But as I took another sip of my drink, I realized that the room had grown colder, the light dimming as though the sun had momentarily lost its grip on the day. A subtle disturbance, almost imperceptible, like the slight hum of a distant opera. I folded the paper, set it down, and stared out at the river once again, where the ripples had begun to form rings in the water, as though something beneath had moved just enough to break the surface. It was such things that I was drawn to, those small, unnoticed things that never quite made sense until much later. And yet I knew, even then, that my attention would not be easily swayed, not by a newspaper story, not by a distant death. Oxford had a way of doing that to you, making even the most immediate things feel as though they could wait forever. But there was something else in the story, something unspoken that curled itself around the edges of my thoughts, like smoke from a forgotten fire. I leaned back in my chair and waited, letting the evening settle into its familiar rhythm, the shadows growing longer, the world outside continuing its quiet spin. There were no answers here, not yet, just the inevitable turning of the page, the next clue yet to be found. I had known, almost from the moment the paper slipped through my fingers, that something would drag me to St. Cuthbert's. Oxford has a way of holding on to its secrets in the quietest of places, and this was no exception. The death, sudden, unexplained, had no immediate appeal. Death is a frequent visitor here, though its face changes. It's the nature of the city, or perhaps simply the nature of time. A final breath echoes in the chapel, a final footstep in the library corridors. All that remains is the residue, the subtle weight of the past. But still, when Lewis rang me later that evening, there had been a certain weight in his voice. There always is. Not the desperation of a younger constable, nor the smugness of a solved case. Just that quiet, settled urgency, as though something was out of place. I met him at the foot of Magdalen Bridge, and from there we walked together, both of us immersed in the kind of silence that you learn to cherish, the kind that speaks louder than words. St. Cuthbert's, with its ivy-covered stone and narrow-arched doors, looked as though it had been taken directly from some long-forgotten painting. Time here moved differently, as though it had learned to fold in on itself. The guest house, where Professor Harland had died, was tucked away behind the main buildings, its windows framed in dark oak, the roof slightly slanted as though it were trying to escape its past. Inside, the place was as still as a museum. The air had the faint mustiness of old books, the kind of air you find in forgotten corners of libraries, where pages no longer hold any promise, where even the dust has given up. There was something almost familiar about it, that feeling. I couldn't place it, but it tugged at the back of my mind as I stepped over the threshold, past the threshold of time itself. A quick glance at the room where Harland had been found was enough to confirm the one detail that would haunt me later: the window, open, wide, and still. Lewis had already given me the details. Harland, a professor of medieval studies, had died in his sleep, or so the doctors had believed, but no one could explain why the window was wide open and why he had been found slumped in an armchair, his body still warm. No signs of struggle, no signs of anything really, except for the absence of life itself. I stood in the room for some time, the air thick with an unspeakable tension. The furniture was neat, almost too neat. A book left open on the chair's arm. A cup half emptied, its contents dark and cold, and yet there was a certain neatness to it, as though someone had gone to great lengths to make the room appear undisturbed, while all the while it was nothing but a stage for something else. "Too neat," I said to Lewis, finally breaking the silence. His eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, sir?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "The room is too arranged," I replied. "It's as though someone wanted to create the illusion of peace." Of a natural passing, I stepped closer to the window, examining the latch. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing out of place there. And yet, it wasn't the window that bothered me. Not really. It was the way Harland had been positioned so deliberately. It all pointed to something staged. As I surveyed the rest of the room, my mind ticked, the clock of reasoning beginning its quiet turn. I noted the small details that others would miss. The faintest scrape on the floorboard, a shadow under the desk lamp. Something had happened here, but it wasn't what it appeared to be. The sudden death was no accident. There was more at play, and I knew that it would not be long before it revealed itself. But for now, there was little to do but wait. Wait for the others. Wait for the pieces to align. In the quiet of the room, I felt it, that same gnawing sense of something unsaid, a gap between what was known and what could never be. "I'll need to speak with the staff," I said to Lewis. He nodded and moved toward the door, but before he left, I caught his eye. "And the window, Lewis. Keep an eye on the window." He paused, then nodded again, a silent understanding passing between us. We both knew. There was no such thing as a closed case in Oxford, not really. I'd arrived at St. Cuthbert's on a morning thick with mist, the kind that never quite clears, only shifting its weight from one corner of the world to another. The atmosphere was as oppressive as the silence that stretched between the ancient stone walls. I could feel it, like an ache in the air, pressing down on me even as the faintest of footsteps echoed through the cloisters. Lewis, ever the dutiful sergeant, had already made his rounds, taking statements from the staff and students. It was an arduous process, but someone had to do it, and so I found myself in a room with 4 of the university's brightest minds. Each one, I suspected, clever enough to know exactly what they were hiding, though whether they knew what they were hiding from, I couldn't yet say. First, there was Dr. Rosalind Trent, a woman with sharp features and sharper opinions. She had been Harlan's former protégé, and it didn't take much to see the residue of resentment in her eyes, no matter how composed she tried to appear. Her career had been eclipsed by Harlan's brilliance, or so she would say. I couldn't help but wonder whether it was envy or something more complicated that had turned her admiration into something darker. I found her in her office, surrounded by books, each one a testament to the knowledge she had amassed, yet none could touch the hollow stillness in her voice. She was seated behind a desk, her fingers tracing the edges of an open manuscript as though they were familiar with its contents, as though the words themselves might offer some form of comfort. She glanced up when I entered, her gaze direct but weary. "Detective Morse," she said, her voice calm, but I could detect a tremor beneath it, just a hint of something that might have been nerves. "What brings you to St. Cuthbert's? We're a quiet place, despite the headlines." "Yes," I replied, "so quiet that it seems the noise of Harlan's death has reverberated far beyond the walls of this college. Perhaps I've come to hear that silence for myself." Her lips tightened ever so slightly, a gesture so subtle I almost missed it. It was enough to tell me that I had struck some small chord. The death of Harlan, perhaps, was not just an event, but a disruption in the rhythms of a world she thought she knew. "Do you think his death was an accident?" I asked, my voice drifting, more a thought than a question. Her eyes flitted to the side, the briefest of pauses before she answered. "It's too early to say, but Harlan was a brilliant man, a man of conviction. I would have thought he'd die by his own hand before someone else's." Her words lingered in the air, and for a moment I was unsure whether she was speaking about Harlan or herself. There was something about the way she said it, an undercurrent of something unspoken, a confession perhaps, but not to me. The next to see me was Reverend Matthew Chivers, the chaplain who had been, I was told, an unlikely friend of Harlan's. The man had that serene, well-meaning expression so often worn by those who hide too much behind their calm, even in moments when their thoughts are clearly elsewhere. He sat in a small, cluttered study, the room heavy with the scent of incense, old books, and something else. Something unidentifiable but sharp, like a scent you catch in passing and forget to name. "I assume you've heard the rumors, Inspector," he said, not looking me in the eye, but rather at the small brass cross on the shelf opposite. "That Harlan was somehow mixed up in matters beyond academic discourse. Rumors," I mused aloud, "tend to have a peculiar way of flourishing in the soil of secrecy." "What do you make of them, Father?" His hands twitched, just the smallest movement, but it caught my eye. I wondered if he had been touched by more than just academic rivalry. I prefer to think that Harlan's work and his life were not as murky as they're now made out to be. He was a man of principle. He hesitated, and there was something about the way he let those words drift into the room that made me wonder how much he truly knew about the man he had called a friend. Then, of course, there was Sir Julian Arkwright, the bursar, always on edge, his eyes darting nervously between the piles of financial ledgers he had been forced to open in preparation for our meeting. Arkwright was not so much a man as he was a collection of anxious gestures and clipped words, always calculating, always guarded. He spoke of Harlan in careful, almost pedantic terms, as though anything more personal would be too dangerous to utter. "I'm not an expert in human emotion, Inspector," he said, his voice like a dull scrape against the air. "But Harlan was, how shall I put it, difficult. A man of many ideas, none of which were easy to follow. He glanced at me, his eyes full of something, guilt perhaps, though it was masked well by the dry, almost bureaucratic tone of his voice. And then, of course, there was Clara Harland, the widow. She had the kind of stillness that seemed to transcend grief, as though it were a muscle she had long ago learned to flex. She sat in the same room where her husband had died, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her composure was unsettling, like a mask that could never quite be removed. "I've told you everything I know," she said, her voice soft but firm, as though she had rehearsed it many times. Edwin was a man who could be difficult, yes. But he was also kind. In his way, I let the silence sit for a while, trying to piece together their words, their faces, their gestures, the moments between them that seemed to say more than anything they had uttered aloud. There was something else here, something not quite visible, but just as real as the rest. I could feel it, a subtle undercurrent running through the cold stone walls, in the shadows between their words. I left the room with more questions than I had entered with, and a strange, gnawing sensation settled in my chest. This case, I thought, would not be resolved by what was said. It would be resolved by what had been left unsaid. The notebook was found on a low shelf in the library, tucked between a thick volume of medieval philosophy and a second-hand edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, its cover worn, as though it had been handled by countless hands. A small thing, really, no more than a few dozen pages, most of them filled with Harland's untidy handwriting. At first, it seemed like any other academic relic, a forgotten jumble of notes on an obscure translation or half-finished thoughts on obscure manuscripts. But there was something about the margins, something that made me pause when I first saw them. I had been perusing the shelves of St. Cuthbert's library for a few hours, walking the aisles as one might walk the streets of a city that had long ceased to be familiar. The scent of dust and old paper filled my lungs, and though I had no real reason to be here, the act of searching had become a habit, a necessary part of the process, the ritual of being at once present and absent. I had no idea what I was looking for, nor did I expect to find it. But there it was, the notebook, left in the open as though Harland had wanted someone to find it. I sat at one of the tables, the heavy, dim light from the lamps spilling over the pages. It was the margins that drew me in first. Scribbled notes, barely legible, some in ink, others in pencil, the scrawl wild and unrefined, almost as if he were in a hurry. They didn't make sense at first. The phrases, when read in isolation, were nothing more than passing thoughts, fragments, but they were repeated. Certain lines, certain words, coming back again and again, like echoes through an empty room. The first of these lines was the one that caught my eye. Time, the thief, steals from us, leaving only shadows. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it at first glance, just a weary observation, an echo of something ancient. But it gnawed at me. That line. A man like Harland didn't just jot down a quote from a forgotten poet without reason. And yet he had. It was the repetition, the way it seemed to anchor itself in the corners of the notebook, that suggested something more. I turned the pages slowly, noting the other scribbles that followed. A reference to an old manuscript from the 13th century, a vague allusion to a Latin phrase, "A mortal's heart beats, but it is empty." There were others, too, fragments of poems, ideas that had been abandoned, notes that seemed to mean nothing in isolation. But one stuck out like a pin through a page, barely noticeable at first. It was a single stanza, written in Harland's usual hurried hand, but underlined 3 times, as though it were the key to something he had failed to understand. The lock was never broken, the key was never found. The window remained open, yet the room was always closed, a cryptic verse, to say the least. My mind lingered over it, turning the words over as one might examine an unfamiliar puzzle. Harland had made no attempt to explain it. He had simply written it over and over again, as if hoping that the act of writing it would lead him to something deeper, some understanding. Yet he had left it unexplained, buried among the detritus of his notes, forgotten until now. It was a riddle, one I had no immediate solution for, but which I sensed held the key to something far more complex than a simple case of academic rivalry or sudden death. I leaned back in my chair, the chair creaking beneath me. A shadow passed across the pages, light shifting like a wisp of smoke from a forgotten cigarette. The room was silent, save for the sound of my own breathing, slow and steady. It occurred to me in that moment that Harland had been far more than just a professor. He had been a man preoccupied with something more, something that had been pulling at him long before his death. I closed the notebook gently, as though the answers it contained might still be alive, lingering between the pages. The mystery of Harland's death had become something else, something I hadn't expected. I was no longer chasing a man's last moments. I was chasing his thoughts, his obsessions, his echoes, and somehow I knew they would lead me to the truth. But for now, I was left with more questions than answers, as was always the case. I stood up and placed the notebook back on the shelf, the weight of its cryptic contents still lingering in my mind. The echoes of the past had only just begun to reverberate. It had been days, or perhaps only hours. It's hard to say when a case like this begins to feel like a slow descent into something darker. Time, after all, has a peculiar way of losing its clarity when you stand on the edge of a mystery. St. Cuthbert's had begun to feel like a weight pressing in on me, the stone walls, the endless corridors, each corner filled with the echo of something long buried. Harland's death had become something more than just an incident. It was as though it had seeped into the very fabric of the place, warping everything around it. By the time I returned to my small, cluttered office at the station, the theory I'd begun to piece together felt almost too neat, too satisfying in its simplicity. Harland, it seemed, had been a man with far more enemies than one would have guessed at first glance. A colleague, perhaps, too jealous of his academic success, too eager to see him fail. It was a common story, one I'd heard countless times before. Academic rivalry, the kind that simmers quietly beneath the surface, invisible to everyone except the ones caught in its grip. I had spent the morning with the few remaining colleagues who had been close to Harland, probing at their stories, watching for the subtle clues that would confirm my growing suspicion. And then, as the day turned to evening, the solution had come to me, almost too neatly, too perfectly. A jealous scholar, driven by years of bitterness, finally striking out in anger. A crime of passion, if you will. It was a tidy solution, almost poetic in its simplicity. Too poetic. Lewis was there, of course, watching as I laid out the pieces before him. "It makes sense, doesn't it?" I had said, my voice a little too eager, a little too certain. The words felt heavy in the air, even as I said them. It had all clicked into place. Harland's rivalry with Dr. Trent the Bitter. Undercurrent between them, and her presence in the guest house the night of his death. She had been the one, I thought, to confront him, to push him to the edge. The open window, the lack of any struggle. She had staged it all, a perfect setup to make it look like an accident, a death by misadventure. But even as I spoke, I could feel the weight of doubt settling over me. It was a theory that fit the facts too well, and therein lay the problem. I had seen it before, countless times. When a case feels too perfect, when the pieces fall too easily into place, it is almost always the wrong answer. I could not shake the feeling that something was being hidden, something just out of reach, something that would make all this make sense in a way I had not yet imagined. I stood and walked over to the window, watching the rain fall in sheets against the stone courtyard below. The world outside was blurring, the edges softening in the damp light. It was like the case itself, I thought, fuzzy, indistinct, with things hiding just beneath the surface. I had no real answers, Not yet, but I could feel that I was on the edge of something. I just couldn't quite see it. The crossword puzzle I had abandoned weeks ago caught my eye then, lying forgotten on the desk. The clue that had puzzled me earlier came back to me now, trapped by absence, still seen. At the time, it had been nothing more than an idle distraction, something to fill the empty space between my thoughts. But now, in the context of everything I had learned, it seemed to flicker with meaning. Absence. Stillness. A thing not quite present, but there, nonetheless. It was a description of Harlan's death, I realized. A presence that had been removed, but whose absence could not be ignored. I sat back down at my desk, the theory still lingering in the back of my mind. Dr. Trent was still the prime suspect, of course, but there was a nagging feeling that I had missed something. Something small, something hidden in the details. I had read Harlan's notebook again, and the words, "The lock was never broken, the key was never found," rang in my ears. The answer, I thought, lay there, but I could not yet unlock it. I called Lewis in, though I was sure he would not offer much more than the same tired observations. I needed to see the facts again, to retrace my steps, to re-examine the crime scene, to listen more closely to what had been left unsaid. My instinct told me that the real solution was not in the things that were visible, but in those that were hidden, those that had been left in the shadows. "I'll need to speak with the others again," I said, my voice low. Lewis nodded, a little too quickly, but his eyes betrayed him. He was eager to close the case, eager to find an answer. But I could feel it. There was no answer yet, not one I could accept. The truth was waiting, just out of reach, and I would find it, eventually. But not today. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, watching the amber liquid swirl in the glass, and waited. The theory, for all its allure, was not the truth. There was more to it, always more. And it was in those gaps, those absences, that the answer would eventually emerge. I find it curious, the way a place can shape a conversation. The King's Arms had always been a sanctuary for me, a place where the murmur of old voices seemed to blend with the shadows, and the clink of glass could mask 1,000 unsaid thoughts. The rain had begun to fall in earnest that evening, the kind of rain that soaks through the bones, though it barely seemed to touch the cobblestones outside. Inside, the low hum of the pub felt almost like a lullaby, the conversation around me faint but persistent, like the memory of a distant opera. I sat by the window, a glass of wine in front of me, its color dark and rich, the scent heavy with hints of earth and autumn. I wasn't there to enjoy it, of course. Wine has never been about pleasure for me, but about the quiet moments it offers for reflection. My thoughts had been preoccupied with Dr. Rosalind Trent. There was something about her that unsettled me, and I had come to the pub not for the wine, but for the quiet distance it gave me from her. Her words had echoed in my mind since our last conversation, and I was drawn to her as much by what she didn't say as by what she did. The door creaked open, and she walked in. Rosalind, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot, her steps slow and deliberate as though she had all the time in the world. She saw me immediately, as though she had been looking for me, though I had no idea why. She made no move to acknowledge me right away, instead choosing a seat at the bar, her back turned to the room, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. She ordered wine, of course, and I watched her through the soft haze of my glass. There was something about her that was both sharp and distant. Her eyes, yes, but also the way she held herself, as though she were always keeping a step ahead, guarding some piece of herself that was not to be shared. She had been, I was told, Harlan's protégé. But what kind of protégé has no affection for her mentor? The kind that stands a little too close to the flame, perhaps, but never quite burns. I saw her glance at me, a flicker of recognition, but she did not come over. She never did. Yet the stillness of her gaze was enough to invite me in. I'd always found that curious. how the absence of an invitation can sometimes be far more compelling than any spoken words. I walked toward her, my steps careful, almost measured, though my mind was far from calm. When I stood beside her, she did not look up, but the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass told me she was aware of my presence. "I trust you're finding Oxford to your liking," I asked, the words drifting from my mouth as easily as they would have if I had asked her about the weather. Her voice was low, steady. "Oxford is always the same. It's people who change." She turned her head slightly, and I could feel her eyes upon me now, studying me with a familiarity that was disquieting. "Or perhaps it's you who has changed, Morse. What brings you here tonight, to this haven of idle chatter?" It was an odd thing to say, but I let it pass, for I knew she had no interest in idle chatter. Her words were always deliberate, calculated. She wasn't interested in small talk, not now, not after everything. "I'm here," I said, "because I find the sound of wine glasses more honest than most conversations. They reveal things." Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling slightly in something that might have been a smile, but not quite. "What do they reveal?" she asked, her voice still quiet, though I could sense the thin thread of tension beneath it. I leaned in a little, allowing the space between us to close just enough. "That what is drunk is often more truthful than what is spoken." There was a pause, a delicate silence that stretched between us like the threads of a spider's web, thin, fragile, but holding everything in place. Then, without warning, she placed her glass down on the bar with a soft click, and her eyes met mine directly. "You think I killed him?" she said, the words falling like pebbles in a still pond. I'd not expected her to say it. I hadn't expected her to admit what I'd never said aloud. But there it was, in the open, as though she had been waiting for me to confront her with it. "You're quick to judge, aren't you, Inspector?" she continued, her voice now edged with something darker. "But I have no need for his death, only for his silence." The room seemed to grow colder, despite the fire crackling nearby. The soft hum of the pub faded into the background, and I realized that we were no longer speaking in riddles. The silence that had always hung between us was now palpable, thick with unspoken truths. "You wanted him gone," I said softly, my voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Her eyes flashed, just for a moment, but it was enough. There was something in that flicker, something I had not seen before, something that told me more than her words ever would. But as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, replaced by the same cool, unreadable mask she had worn since we first met. She picked up her glass again, raising it to her lips without another word, and I knew as I stood there watching her that I had learned nothing new. But the silence between us had grown deeper, more complicated. There was a secret buried beneath the polished surface of her words and gestures, and I, like a fool, had barely begun to scratch at it. The rain had subsided by the time I reached the Harland residence, leaving the air thick with the scent of damp earth and an almost oppressive quiet. The evening had descended like a heavy curtain, and the house, like so many others in Oxford, stood as if untouched by time, its stone facade barely illuminated by the soft glow from inside. I was no stranger to such houses, and though I had been in this one only once before, I felt an odd familiarity with its gloom, the muted footsteps in the hallways, the faint rustling of curtains behind closed windows. It was as though the past lingered in the walls, always present, never quite gone. I had not intended to speak with Clara Harland again, at least not so soon. But something had shifted after our last encounter, a tension that hung in the air between us, delicate but undeniable. I could feel it even now as I stood at the door, my hand poised before the knocker. The invitation had come in the form of a letter, terse but polite, with a faint undercurrent of something else. Something I could not name, but knew I would understand once I stepped inside. The door opened quietly, and there she was, Clara Harland, still composed, as always. The woman had an uncanny ability to remain perfectly still, as though her emotions were nothing but a distant memory, neatly packed away in some forgotten corner of her mind. Her eyes, too, were unreadable, and yet there was something in them now, a glimmer of something unspoken, something that felt like a confession waiting to be released. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of something heavier than mere politeness. "I trust you're not here to ask more questions." Her words were casual, but I could see the subtle tension in her posture, the way she gripped the door frame slightly tighter than necessary. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something just as telling, a kind of quiet readiness, as though she knew this moment would come and had been preparing for it all along. "No," I replied, my voice quiet, unhurried. "Not questions." Not yet. I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, as I always did. I could tell from the brief flicker of her eyes that she had expected me to do just that. The room smelled faintly of lavender, and the air was cooler here, the fireplace cold and unused. I glanced around, taking in the sparse decor, the kind of carefully curated simplicity that suggested more about its owner's nature than any photograph or story ever could. A portrait of Edwin Harland, placed neatly on the mantel, seemed to watch over the room like a silent sentinel. His absence was felt more in the air than in any tangible way. "I know why you're here," Clara said, her words so quietly spoken that I had to lean in slightly to catch them. She was standing near the window, her back to me, her gaze distant, as though she was searching for something in the dim light outside. "You've been thinking about Edwin's death, haven't you?" I said nothing. It wasn't necessary. She already knew, of course. It was always the way with people like Clara, those who were accustomed to keeping their thoughts locked away, but who could, with a single glance, understand the unspoken in others. "I never wanted him dead, you know," she continued, her voice still soft, though the weight of it began to press on me, like a slow tide rising. "It wasn't my choice." She turned, just enough to meet my eyes, and there was something in her gaze, something I hadn't seen before. It was not guilt, not exactly, but the flicker of something else. Regret, perhaps, or something deeper, something darker. "I've never been one for lies, Inspector," she said, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "I've always believed that the truth is a thing best faced." She hesitated, then stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "But the truth, it's not what you think it is." Not about Edwin. Not about anything. I waited, letting the silence fall between us. I'd always believed that the truth, when it came, would be revealed in fragments, pieces that didn't quite fit together until one day, when everything was laid bare, the picture would emerge. But there was something about Clara that suggested the truth wasn't so easily grasped. It was, perhaps, more elusive than that. "You're right," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "The truth is rarely what it seems." I took a step closer, my gaze never leaving hers. But sometimes, the smallest thing can change everything. Her eyes flickered then, just for a moment, and I knew. I knew she was about to say something, something that would change the course of everything I had thought I understood. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, beneath her carefully constructed silence. And now it was about to come tumbling out, whether she liked it or not. "It was the will," she said finally, her words barely audible, but they landed like stones in the quiet room. "Edwin had changed it, without telling me. And there were things in it, things I couldn't accept. I said nothing, but I felt the weight of it. The pieces were beginning to fall, one by one, and the picture they formed was darker than I had imagined. This was not a simple case of grief or betrayal. It was something more, something far more complicated. She stepped back, her expression unreadable once again. "I never wanted it to end like this," she said, the words carrying a quiet finality. And with that, The moment passed. I didn't press her further. There was no need. The truth was already there, just beneath the surface. Now it was my turn to find it. The chapel was quieter than usual that morning, its stone walls, as always, whispering secrets into the stillness. The light filtering through the stained glass windows cast faint, colored patterns on the floor, their shapes shifting with the slow passage of time, much like the case itself. Ever changing, ever elusive. I had not intended to visit the chapel. But sometimes the city of Oxford has a way of pulling you toward the places you least expect, toward the details that you do not yet understand. Father Matthew Chivers was there, of course, standing by the altar, his hands folded, his eyes cast downward in prayer, or so it seemed. It was a quiet morning, the kind that leaves everything feeling suspended, as if even the air had paused for a moment, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. And yet I had no doubt that something was about to happen. Something small, something barely noticeable, that would change the course of the investigation, as so many small things have a way of doing. I stood at the back of the chapel, my eyes drifting from the altar to the pews, then back again. The space seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows dark and thick in the corners, as if the chapel itself were holding its breath. And then I saw it. Father Chivers, his hand reaching up to touch the old brass lectern, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. A small gesture, a brief movement, but it was enough to catch my attention. I had never fully trusted the man, though I had not yet found a reason to suspect him. His demeanor was always so calm, so measured, that it felt as though there was something hidden beneath the surface, something that could not be easily uncovered. I had seen him before, of course, during my earlier investigations, but there was something different in him now, something faintly off. His calmness seemed more like a veneer, a fragile mask that was beginning to crack under the weight of whatever it was he was hiding. I walked slowly toward the front of the chapel, my footsteps muffled by the ancient stone floor. As I approached, Chivers turned, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest of moments, but it was enough to read the faint flicker of surprise in them. The moment passed quickly, and he lowered his gaze once again. "Inspector," he said, his voice as soft as ever, though there was a slight tightness to it now. "I trust you're not here for a sermon." "Not today," I replied, my voice equally low, though I've always thought there is something calming about the silence of a place like this. It seems to bring out the truth in people. His eyes flickered again, just for a moment, before he turned his attention back to the lectern. "The truth, Inspector, is often not what we want it to be. Sometimes it's better to leave things untouched, to let them lie where they fall." There it was again. The subtle shift in his voice, the weight behind his words. They were not meant for me, of course. No. He was speaking to himself, or perhaps to the memory of something he had long buried. But in that moment, I understood. Harlan's death was not just an academic rivalry, nor was it simply the result of a late-night argument. No, this was something far more personal. A secret that had been festering, perhaps for years, within the walls of this very chapel. I glanced toward the lectern again, the small brass plate engraved with a verse from the Psalms. It was an innocuous enough detail, a simple, decorative touch that most would overlook, but as I studied it, something in the way the light struck it caught my attention. The edges of the plate were worn, faint scratches marking its surface, as if it had been handled more than usual, more than a piece of furniture should be. "You've been busy, Father," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. More than usual, it seems. He stiffened, just a fraction, but it was enough. His hand, still resting on the lectern, clenched briefly before he forced it open again, a subtle sign of tension, of something giving way beneath the surface. "I've had a few personal matters to attend to," he said, his words clipped, measured. I could hear the lie in his voice, thin and fragile as it was. The tension between us thickened, but I allowed it to hang in the air, unspoken. The truth was just out of reach, but I could feel it, like the faintest of echoes, reverberating through the hollow of the chapel. And then, as quickly as the tension had arrived, it dissipated. Chivers turned away from the lectern, his back now fully to me. "Perhaps it's best if you leave the past where it belongs, Inspector," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "Some things are not for you to uncover." I knew then that I had touched a nerve, and though I had not yet uncovered the full extent of his involvement in the events surrounding Harlan's death, I knew one thing with certainty. The chapel, with its secrets and its shadows, had become something more than just a red herring. It was a clue, a marker in the puzzle that was beginning to fall into place. The pieces were scattered, but they were no longer as far apart as they had seemed. I nodded, silently, and turned to leave. The mystery, it seemed, was becoming far more intricate than I had anticipated. The fog had descended once more upon Oxford, wrapping the city in its damp, spectral embrace. I stood at the window of my office, watching as the shapes of people passed by in blurred silhouettes, their footsteps muffled by the thick mist that clung to the cobblestones like a memory one can never quite shake off. It was the sort of day that made one feel as though the past had never truly left, but lingered just behind the veil, waiting for a chance to return. It was on such a day that the missing page surfaced again, just when I had almost begun to forget about it, as though it had been silently biding its time. I'd returned to Harlan's notebook once more, turning the pages slowly, as one does when looking for something that is not meant to be found, when the mind is too restless to leave well enough alone. The notebook had yielded its cryptic verses, but the last page, lost, forgotten, had remained elusive, slipping through my fingers like the last remnants of a dream that never quite materialized. I had almost given up hope of ever finding it, dismissing the thought that it might be more than a piece of academic scribbling, a forgotten draft of Harlan's unfinished work. But it was in the library, of all places, that the page reappeared, tucked, of all things, inside a dusty volume of the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, a book that had no bearing on Harlan's research, but whose presence seemed almost too deliberate. As if the page had been waiting for me to discover it, just as the fog had been waiting for the right moment to descend. I knew it immediately. The torn edge of the paper was unmistakable, the same faded ink. It had been carefully tucked away, hidden in plain sight, as though someone had deliberately left it there for me to find, but had left no other trace, no other clue to explain why. The pages of Harlan's work had never been ordered in such a way. It was too neat, too deliberate. This was no accident. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me as I picked it up, though I could not yet explain why. The words on the page seemed to burn themselves into my mind. A final verse, different from the others, less cryptic but more dangerous in its clarity. The truth is never what it seems. It is buried deep beneath the seams. A locked door, a broken key, a secret never meant to be. I read it twice, then 3 times. The meaning began to unfurl in my mind, though still something about it eluded me. I'd always known that Harlan's work held more than academic value, but now I began to understand. The secrets were not in his translations or his obscure references. They were in the spaces between the words, in the gaps where truth and lie had become indistinguishable. The clue was there, buried beneath layers of words, and yet I could not see it entirely. It was a riddle, yes, but one that no longer felt like a puzzle to be solved. It felt like an invitation, a deliberate provocation. Someone had left this for me to find, but why? What did they want me to understand? And more importantly, who else knew about it? The quiet sense of unease, which had never quite left me, returned once again, heavier now, as though the case had moved beyond mere investigation and into the realm of personal entanglement. The missing page had returned, but it had brought with it more questions than answers. I closed the book with care, placing the page inside as though the act of hiding it again might somehow protect it. But I knew, deep down, that the secrets it held were already in motion. Later that evening, as I sat in the king's arms, I could feel the weight of the puzzle bearing down on me. I had no answers, not yet, but the silence that surrounded me felt different now, charged, as though every quiet conversation in the pub was a murmur of something far more significant. I had made progress, but in the wrong direction. The page had given me no answers. It had only shifted the ground beneath my feet, and yet, as I sipped my whiskey, the thought lingered in my mind, as persistent as the fog outside. The truth had always been buried beneath layers, yes. But now, it seemed it was not just Harlan's truth I was meant to uncover. It was someone else's, a hidden figure, one who had been watching from the shadows all along. There was something in the way the page had been returned to me, something deliberate in its timing, and for the first time in the investigation, I felt the faint stirrings of something approaching understanding, but I was not yet ready to chase it. Not yet. I left the pub that night, the mist thick around me, and walked slowly back to my office. The sounds of the city muffled by the fog, the page, the words, the verses. They were all there, lingering in my mind, waiting for me to see the connections I had missed. The case was moving forward, yes, but it was not moving in a straight line, and that, I realized, was the real danger. It had become less about the who and the why, and more about the spaces between them, the spaces I had yet to explore. The evening had fallen cold, a late autumn chill seeping into the very bones of the city. I stood by the fireplace in my office, watching the flames flicker and die in that strange, almost poetic rhythm, as if they, too, were trying to decide whether they should be alive or gone. The room smelled faintly of tobacco, dust, and old whiskey, a scent that I, too often, found myself lost in. I was no stranger to solitude, but that night the weight of it settled differently on my shoulders. There was something at the edge of the case, something that had been whispering at the back of my mind for days, and I could no longer ignore it. Sir Julian Arkwright's face had remained with me, the shadow of his anxiety still hanging in the air like a cloud. The bursar of St. Cuthbert's, a man I'd come to think of as a fixture in the university's slow, scholarly machinery. He had that face, one of unyielding formality, the kind you see on statues erected to obscure figures long forgotten. But there was more to Arkwright, something beneath the surface, something that kept flickering at the edges of my thoughts. The more I examined his actions, his discomfort in his own skin, the more I found myself circling around him, as one circles an object too close to be touched, but too important to be ignored. It had been a week since I had last spoken to him. He had spoken of Harlan's death with such cold detachment, one might have believed that his only concern was the academic schedule. But I had known better. The way his hand had trembled ever so slightly when he placed the ledger on my desk, the way his eyes had darted to the open window as though looking for something or perhaps someone. I'd called him back to my office that evening under the pretense of needing clarification on his earlier statements. It was a flimsy excuse, but I didn't need much to prompt a deeper conversation. When he arrived, his expression was strained, as though he had been expecting this meeting for longer than he would admit. Arkwright was a man who was used to controlling everything, his environment, his manner, his emotions, but control had a way of slipping, like sand through clenched fingers. "I'm sure you're wondering why I've called you back, Sir Julian," I began, not giving him the opportunity to speak just yet. I allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment, letting the weight of my presence settle on him. "You were, how shall I say, a little too calm last time we spoke. I think perhaps you know more than you've told me." He stiffened, and in that subtle movement I knew. The mask had cracked, just a fraction, but it was enough to let the truth slip through. "I've already told you all I know, Morse," he said, his voice taut. "Harlan's death was tragic, but surely you don't think I had anything to do with it." I watched him closely, his face too composed, too practiced. His words, though still polite, rang hollow. There was guilt in them, buried deep beneath the surface. Not the kind of guilt that comes with a confession, no, but the kind of guilt that is wrapped in a lie so carefully constructed that it nearly suffocates the truth within it. "The death of Professor Harlan," I said softly, leaning back in my chair, watching him, "seems to have caused quite an upheaval at St. Cuthbert's. Some would say too much upheaval, given the circumstances I allowed the words to settle in the air between us. And yet you seem remarkably unaffected. A man with such attachment to the college." His eyes flicked away for a moment, just enough for me to catch it. That tiny fraction of a second was enough. He began, but then faltered. The hesitation in his voice confirmed everything I needed to know. The collector's guilt had crept in, wearing the guise of academic devotion. Arkwright had been a man collecting more than just rare manuscripts, I realized. He had been collecting debts, and now they were coming due. "You knew about Harlan's research into the old texts," I continued, watching him closely. "You knew that he had discovered something in those manuscripts. Something that might have undermined your, let's say, financial interests." His jaw tightened, and his fingers drummed softly on the armrest of his chair. "I had no such knowledge," he said, but the words were a little too quick, a little too sharp. Another crack in his facade. "The thing is, Sir Julian," I said, my voice low, deliberate, "it's not just about the manuscripts, is it? It's about the power they gave you, the control, and I think that's why Harlan had to die. You couldn't afford for him to expose you." There was no immediate response, no denial, only a slight shift in his posture, a barely perceptible retreat. I knew then that I had touched a nerve. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, but there was a tremor in his voice now. The lies were coming undone, one by one, and with them the truth was spilling out, just beneath the surface. I let the silence fill the room once more, its weight heavy, its meaning clear. The pieces were slowly falling into place. I would have to tread carefully now, for the guilt Arkwright carried was not one of murder. It was the guilt of a man who had buried too many secrets and whose control was slipping just beyond reach. It was the guilt of a man who had collected far more than he was willing to lose. And it was the kind of guilt that, when exposed, would bring down everything he had built. I stood, my glass in hand, and nodded toward the door. "I think we're done here, Sir Julian," I said quietly. "For now." The rain was still falling when I left the station, a steady drizzle that blurred the edges of everything it touched. I had spent the entire day, perhaps longer, sifting through the remnants of what remained of the case. Pieces had begun to fit together, but the puzzle was not yet solved, and I found myself still unable to trust any of the neatly tied conclusions that had been offered. It was all too easy now, too comfortable, as though the truth had been left in the hands of those who wished it to be buried. Oxford, as always, clung to its secrets with the kind of silent dignity that only a city of this age could muster. By the time I reached the flat, the world outside had taken on a half-life of its own, shrouded in mist and shadow. The usual quiet of the place felt heavier tonight, as though the walls themselves were waiting, listening for something that never arrived. I had no particular inclination to do anything in particular. Not that evening. The investigations, the theories, they all seemed like distant concerns now. Sometimes it felt as though everything had become noise, a drone in the back of my mind, too much to process at once. I poured a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid swirled in the glass like a small, steady flame. Then, for reasons I couldn't explain, I moved to the piano. It had been there, of course, for longer than I cared to admit. A relic of another time, another life, one I had long since pushed aside. But there was something about the weight of the day, the endless questions without answers, that made me want to seek the familiarity of something far simpler. Music, after all, was always there when words failed. It had always been a companion when I found myself alone with my thoughts. I sat down at the piano and let my fingers drift over the keys, the quiet notes filling the room in soft, slow waves. It wasn't a piece I knew well, not one I had played often. It was a simple tune, really, nothing more than a memory lingering in the back of my mind. But as I played, I felt the weight of the case lifting, just slightly, the tension in my chest easing, if only for a moment. The melody became something of a conversation, unspoken, certainly, but no less real for that, and yet, even in the quiet of the music, there was still the sense that something was missing, something I had overlooked, something vital that had yet to make itself known. I paused, my fingers resting on the keys, as the familiar ache of unspoken truths settled into my chest once more. It had been days, perhaps more, since I had last heard the sound of the music, of a piano that had long been neglected, like the rest of my thoughts. The truth, when it came, would not be so kind, I knew. It would not come in the form of a neatly wrapped answer. The pieces would not fit in the way I had hoped. The weight of the unanswered questions would remain, hanging like a shadow over everything else. The case had become something more, I realized. It was no longer simply a puzzle to be solved. It was a reflection of something far more elusive, something I'd been running from for years. The pieces would fall into place only when I had the patience to see them for what they were. I returned my attention to the piano, my fingers beginning the melody once again, though the music had changed this time, subtly, as if it, too, had been affected by the weight of the questions that hung in the air. And there, in the midst of it, I found the small, quiet answer to something I had not expected. Music, I thought, was not meant to offer answers. It was meant to offer a brief reprieve from the silence that so often surrounded us. The spaces between the notes, the pauses, the moments of quiet reflection between each phrase, held just as much meaning as the music itself. As I played, the realization came slowly, like the last notes of a forgotten tune drifting away. There was no easy answer to the case. No neat conclusion waiting to be discovered. The truth would emerge, but only when it was ready to be seen, when the music had played itself out. Until then, all I could do was listen, to the rhythm of the questions, to the stillness between the answers, and to the music that, for now, would be enough. I finished my drink and set the glass down, the weight of it heavy in my hand. I looked out the window at the fog that had begun to settle once more over Oxford, and for the first time in days I felt the quiet certainty that I had not been wrong to trust the silence, the music, the empty spaces. It was all part of the same truth, one that was still waiting to be uncovered. For now, though, there was only the sound of the piano and the quiet that followed. The fog had returned to Oxford that evening, a damp, suffocating presence that clung to the streets and drifted through the alleys, obscuring everything in its path. I sat in my office, the dim light of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The case was, in many ways, still incomplete, its edges frayed, its answers stubbornly elusive. Yet there was a feeling, an odd kind of certainty, that had settled in my chest as I looked back over the events of the past few weeks. It was not the certainty of a solved mystery, but of something much quieter, something deeper. The missing page had returned, and with it, the truth had begun to take shape, only not in the way I had expected. I had thought the case was about a simple death, a tragic accident, perhaps even a murder of passion. But now, as I reflected on the details, I realized how little of it had been simple, how little of it had been what it first appeared to be. Harlan's death was not the end of something. It was only the beginning, the first line of a much larger, darker narrative that I had only just begun to grasp. I had visited St. Cuthbert's one last time, unable to shake the feeling that there was something more hiding in its walls, something that had been waiting for me to understand. The chapel had been quiet, the shadows deepening in the corners, and yet I had found no further answers there. Instead, I had returned to the guest house where Harland had died, hoping that something, anything, might reveal itself now that I had seen the connections more clearly. The window, still open in my mind, had become a symbol of the puzzle I could not quite piece together. The truth, I had come to realize, was always just beyond reach. I had been chasing it, perhaps too relentlessly, as though it was something to be caught, something that could be pinned down with the right words or the right conclusion. But it was not like that, I now understood. It was a thing that moved, that shifted in the shadows, just out of the light's grasp. It was something that would always remain open, a window that refused to close. I sat back in my chair, the glass of whiskey still in my hand, and let the silence settle around me. The rain tapped gently at the window pane, a soft, rhythmic sound that felt oddly comforting, as though the world outside was pressing its questions against the glass, waiting for me to answer. But I had no answers, not yet. All I had were questions, questions that had been asked and answered, only to be asked again. The window remained open, its secret still hidden in the dark. The knock on my door startled me, though it was a sound I had been expecting. I set the glass down carefully and called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Come in." Lewis stepped inside, his face as unreadable as ever, though there was a certain unease in his eyes. He had become accustomed to the quiet pace of the investigation, to the long hours and the endless wondering, but something had changed in him as well. He had begun to understand, perhaps, what it meant to chase something elusive, something that refused to be understood. And yet, like me, he could not help but keep moving forward. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet, respectful, "the chaplain's been asking about you again. Seems he's concerned you're looking into matters best left alone." I nodded slowly, a wry smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. I knew exactly what Father Chivers was trying to protect. And yet, in the end, it was not the past he was afraid of. It was the future. The secrets of St. Cuthbert's, the one buried in the silence of its ancient walls, were not meant to be uncovered, but they would be. It was only a matter of time. "The window remains open," I said softly, more to myself than to Lewis. "And some doors should never be closed." Lewis stood there for a moment, as if waiting for something more, but there was nothing more to say. The case was not finished, not by a long shot, and yet, for the first time, I felt the quiet certainty that it would be. In the end, the window would close, but only when it was ready, and until then, I would wait. Wait for the truth to make itself known, as it always did, in the spaces between what we could see and what we could not. The rain continued to fall, the world outside as blurred and uncertain as ever. But inside, in the quiet of my office, there was only the soft sound of the whiskey pouring into my glass, the gentle murmur of the city beyond, and the steady, unbroken silence that would, in time, reveal everything. The window remains open, and so I wait, 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 and so